3:12 a.m., North Sea. The men of U-31 woke to a single, muffled thud somewhere behind them. Not the sharp, rising sound of an enemy depth charge, not the echo of a torpedo. Just a single, heavy detonation rolling through the hull like distant thunder. They rushed to the hydrophones, scanning for propellers, for movement. Nothing. Then another blast, closer this time. The captain leaned over the magnetic indicator. One of their freshly deployed mines had vanished from the grid. A few seconds later, a second disappeared. Then a third. The radio operator wrote it down automatically. Mines detonating spontaneously. Cause unknown. Outside, the sea was black and heavy. Frost covered the deck. The crew could see their breath hanging in the air, small clouds of fear. The captain noted in the log. The sea behaves strangely tonight, as if something alive moves beneath us. It was November 1939, only weeks after Germany had unleashed its new secret weapon, the magnetic mine. A sleek, round cylinder, it didn't need to touch its target. It waited, silent and invisible, until a ship's magnetic field passed overhead. Then it would detonate, ripping through the hull, breaking the ship in two before anyone even saw the flash. The strategy was simple. Choke Britain's trade routes, turn the Channel and the Thames estuary into death zones. Dozens of U-boats were sent to scatter the mines across the shipping lanes. The results, at first, were terrifying. Civilian ships vanished without warning. Fishing boats returned with stories of explosions that came from nowhere. The British Admiralty was desperate, confused, and bleeding tonnage every week. But then, suddenly, something changed. In early November, German patrols began reporting strange failures. Mines that never armed. Others that detonated without a ship in sight. Commanders dismissed it as manufacturing defects. The cold affects the circuits, one engineer suggested. It's saltwater corrosion, said another. Yet the pattern grew. By the end of the month, whole fields of mines were vanishing from charts, detonating in quiet bays, far from any British vessel. Some U-boat officers swore they saw flashes under the surface, as if the ocean itself had learned to fight back. One report from U-13 read simply, "The sea destroys our own weapons." The High Command in Wilhelmshaven demanded an explanation. Admiral Donitz, still confident in his wolf packs, dismissed talk of sabotage. "There are no ghosts in the sea," he told his officers. But privately, he added a note to his staff. "If the British have found a countermeasure, find it before they use it against us." Meanwhile, British coastal patrols were recovering strange fragments, twisted metal spheres, half-melted coils, residue that glowed faintly under a compass. Some pieces were still warm, as though charged with unseen energy. The engineers studying them began to suspect that something deeper was happening beneath the waves. At the Admiralty's experimental station near Portsmouth, a small group of scientists gathered around the fragments in silence. One of them, a physicist named Frederick Lindemann, turned the shard over in his gloved hands. "Magnetic," he said softly. "It reacts to the Earth's field. That's how they're doing it." Another officer asked, "Then why are they blowing themselves up?" Lindemann paused. "Because something's changing the field." He looked out toward the gray water of the Solent, where fog rolled low and heavy across the surface. "If their minds can feel a ship's magnetism," he said, "then maybe we can give them something else to feel." Out in the North Sea, the crew of U-31 waited for orders that never came. The mines kept disappearing from their charts, one by one. They floated in the freezing dark, unsure if the next explosion would come from the enemy, or from the weapons they had just laid. In his final log entry that night, the captain wrote, "Our instruments are useless. The compass spins without reason. The sea glows faintly under the periscope, as if charged with something unnatural. I no longer trust the silence." He didn't know that, hundreds of miles away, British engineers were already testing a prototype cable stretched across the estuary, a thin, electric vein pulsing current into the seabed. When the switch was thrown, the water trembled. Seconds later, a distant boom echoed through the fog. The observers looked at one another in disbelief. It worked. They had found a way to turn the enemy's invention against him, to make the mines destroy themselves. No gunfire, no ships, just the hum of a cable hidden beneath the sea. And as more explosions rolled across the night, one of the engineers whispered, "It's as if we've taught the ocean to fight." But in the depths, the German submariners still clung to their controls, watching their charts go blank, thinking the sea itself had turned against them. They didn't yet know. This wasn't nature's revenge. It was man's. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The red pins on the Admiralty map clustered around the Thames like drops of blood. Each pin marked a blast reported by coastal watchers. No ship nearby, no wake on the water, only a ripple of light under the fog and a dull concussion that rattled window panes in Gravesend. In the basement at Whitehall, a small knot of men and women stared at the pattern until the room felt colder than the December air. If the minds answer a ship's magnetism, said a tired physicist with an Oxford accent, give them a ship where there is none. He was Frederick Lindemann, thin, sardonic, still smelling of laboratory ether. He tapped the chart with a pencil. We lay a cable here. A long one. Drive a current through the seabed. Make a phantom hull. No one laughed. The Royal Navy had already tried brooms on the surface, grapnels, even brave trawlers dragging chains through black water. Nothing touched the new German minds. They sat deep, listening for a ship's field, patient as sharks. If the only way to find them was to be a ship, then the sea would have to be tricked. The first cable arrived at dawn on a barge covered in tarpaulin and secrecy. Dockyard laborers in wool caps, wrens in blue skirts, a handful of electricians from the railways. This was the crowd that would pull a wire through the ocean. They worked without searchlights. Blackout rules held even for miracles. A winch groaned, rollers squealed, gulls cried, and then fell silent as if warned. The cable slid into the water with a soft hiss, vanishing into pewter-gray waves that lifted and dropped as evenly as breathing. They called it a magnetic sword. A mile of copper and gutta percha laid across the estuary like a nerve. On shore, in a shuttered shed, an engineer checked the rheostat, wiped his palms on a rag, and nodded. Lindemann stood with his hands in his pockets, face expressionless. On my mark, he said, and his voice was very soft for a man about to shake the sea. He raised a finger. The switch clacked. The water shivered. Not visibly, not like in stories. No lightning, no glowing arcs. Only a subtle tightening, as if the tide were drawing in its breath. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the ground under their boots gave a hollow thump, and the fog beyond the pier lifted on a ring of pressure. A second later, the boom reached them, flattening the gulls. Again, Lindemann said. They swept the reach for an hour, stepping the current up and down, moving the phantom ship along the wire. Every few minutes the sea answered. Muffled thunder, a boil of water, shards of black metal spinning briefly on the surface before sinking like dead fish. When they shut down at last, there was nothing to see but tide rip and broken foam, and a clean lane through a minefield no man had entered. What the official log recorded was drier. Test successful. Magnetic influence mine neutralized by induced field. But the men who'd watched wrote different words in their pockets and letters home. We heard the sea obey a switch. The work spread. Cables were laid at Sheerness, Harwich, Scapa Flow. Some installations were fixed swords. Others were temporary sweeps run from trawlers with great loops of wire playing out behind them. The Navy also began a quieter revolution, degaussing. Coils were strapped around hulls. Ships steamed through ranges, where technicians measured their magnetic footprints, then tuned the coils until the vessels passed as nearly invisible iron ghosts. Merchant captains blinked at the strange harnesses wrapped round their ships, then signed for the paperwork and sailed with a little less fear. The numbers shifted. Losses in the Thames approaches fell by half, then by more. Patrol reports from U-boats grew confused. Mines failed to arm. Explosions at anchor with no cause. In Kiel, a designer cursed the English climate. In Wilhelmshaven, a senior officer blamed factory solder. In London, a clerk drew faint pencil lines through last week's red pins and began a new column titled Swept. Not everything worked. A cable snapped in a gale and coiled like a sleeping serpent on a mud bank until a fisherman hauled it up and nearly burned his boat out of the water. A trawler crew misjudged a sweep and lifted a live mine, the deck swallowed by spray and black smoke in an instant. In Scapa Flow, a test blew the windows out of a cottage whose owner simply nailed cardboard over the frames and said nothing. He'd signed a secrecy form like everyone else. Yet the pattern held. Night after night, in huts that smelled of hot copper and tea, signals officers watched needles twitch while the sea thumped obediently beyond. They were winning a battle no papers could print. One evening a young wren named Alice turned the rheostat with careful fingers. The gauge crept, the needle steadied. Nothing. She glanced at the officer. He nodded. A touch more current. This time the boom came not from the cable's end but farther out, as if the sea were coughing up a secret. No one spoke. The chart took another pin, this one blue, cleared by influence. The Admiralty sent a circular, thinly worded and dull. All vessels to fit degaussing coils. Coastal commands to employ electrical sweeps were practicable. The men who read it at breakfast could not know that those lines would keep them alive. Success made the room warmer, but not much. Lindemann, who never smiled at the right moments, tapped his cigarette into a teacup and stared at the ceiling. "We have taught their weapons to die young," he said. "Good." He paused. "Now they will make new ones." He was right. In Kiel and Hamburg, engineers had already started on a different sensor, one that didn't care about magnetism at all. Not the Earth's field, not coils or cables, but the heartbeat of a ship, the throb of propellers, the hum of turbines, the deep, slow pulse that traveled through water like a rumor. For now, the map on the wall showed lanes of safety where a week ago there had been none. The boats came and went, their coils humming, their crews unaware of the invisible shields wrapped round them. London slept a little easier. The pins thinned. And yet, in a cellar where the air tasted of oil and tin, an electrician set down his spanner and cocked his head. Through the floor he could hear the sea, not the percussive thud of a mine, not the growl of current, but a far, steady rhythm, almost like a living thing. He looked at the engineer beside him. "Hear that?" The man listened. Faint, persistent, inhumanly regular. The beat of something learning to listen back. The cable worked. The fields worked. But somewhere beyond the reach of copper and courage, the enemy was teaching his minds to hunt by sound. To win this quiet war, Britain would have to fool more than iron in the water. It would have to fool the water itself and the sky above it. By the summer of 1940, the North Sea had gone eerily calm. No smoke on the horizon, no thunder of explosions, only wind and waves. For the first time in months, British convoys moved through the channel without vanishing into fire. The magnetic mines had stopped working, or so it seemed. In the shipyards of Kiel, German engineers tore apart their failed weapons. The reports from U-boat captains were humiliating. Fields of mines detonating for no reason, whole shipments lost before reaching the enemy. "The English," one officer muttered, "have changed the sea." Admiral Donitz wanted answers. If the British could fool a magnetic mine, then the next weapon had to listen for something that could not be faked. Within weeks, his engineers created a new device, the Gyrosmine, the noise mine. It didn't respond to magnetism. It listened. Every ship had its own voice. The thrum of propellers, the beat of engines, the vibration of hulls. The Germans built sensors that recognized those sounds and slept until they heard them. Silence meant safety. Noise meant death. The first mines were laid in the autumn of 1940. Days later, a fishing trawler near Dover vanished in a flash of foam. No wreckage, no magnetic trace, just a shattered hull. When divers examined the debris, they realized this explosion came from hearing, not touch. In London, the news struck like a torpedo. Britain's new shield, its magnetic defenses, was useless. At Portsmouth, physicist Frederick Lindemann gathered his exhausted team around a hydrophone. They played back recordings from the channel, the hum of engines, the clicking of gears, the long mechanical pulse of the sea. Then came another sound, thin, metallic, steady. "That," Lindemann said, "is the enemy listening." To fight it, they needed noise of their own. Engineers designed acoustic jammers, steel cylinders that roared underwater, drowning the ship's true sound beneath a false thunder. The first test nearly tore the ship apart. Gauges burst, men fell to the deck, and before anyone could reach the switch, a mine exploded 20 yards away. When the shock passed, the captain only said, "It worked. Now make it survivable." Weeks later, the improved noisemakers were deployed. Minesweepers dragged them behind their hulls, flooding the water with a wall of sound. One by one, The new German mines triggered harmlessly in the empty wake. Pilots flying overhead saw perfect circles of white foam blooming below, flowers of victory in the gray sea. But the Germans adapted. They built dual-trigger mines that listened and felt, waiting for both magnetic pull and engine heartbeat. The war beneath the waves became a duel of invisible inventions. Admirals no longer decided the outcome, engineers did. By winter, Britain had over 2,000 minesweepers at work. They called themselves the silent service of the silent war. Every explosion they caused meant another ship could sail, but every silence meant the enemy had changed the rules again. A young lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We clear a lane tonight, and by morning it's cursed again. The ocean remembers everything we do." Still, Britain held the seas. The new acoustic sweeps, combined with degaussed hulls, pushed German mining back toward the continent. Convoys resumed. London's docks buzzed with life again. And yet, in the small rooms of Harwich and Scapa Flow, the men listening to hydrophones began to notice something new. Tones too regular, too precise, drifting through the static. "Dead channel?" one operator asked. Lindemann shook his head. "No, something's listening back." A dull metallic pulse rolled through the hull. Not an explosion, just a single knock, as if the sea itself had answered. Instruments flickered. The compass spun. The operator looked up. What was that? Lindemann didn't answer. He stared at the glowing water beyond the porthole and whispered, "The next war won't be with guns. It'll be with echoes." Outside, the sea fell silent again. But everyone on board knew what that silence meant. The ocean had learned to hear. In December 1940, Convoy HX-90 cut through the black water of the North Atlantic, a chain of ships glowing faintly under the aurora. The sea was calm, the air brittle with frost. Then, at 3:17, the freighter Appalachia lifted out of the water and vanished in a sheet of flame. No torpedo wake, no U-boat shadow, only a sound. A single turning propeller had betrayed her. That night, the Battle of the Atlantic changed forever. The German Navy had returned to the deep with a new weapon, the acoustic mine. It didn't care about magnetism or current. It listened. Beneath the surface, pressure domes held delicate diaphragms that trembled to the rhythm of engines, awakening only when they heard the right pattern, the heartbeat of a ship. British degaussing coils, the miracle that had made magnetic mines useless, meant nothing now. The ocean itself had become an ear. Within weeks, ships began to vanish again. Trawlers, destroyers, transports. The reports sounded like madness. No contact, no trace, just noise and death. One captain wrote before going down, "The sea hears us now." In London, panic met exhaustion. The scientists who had tamed the magnetic field were summoned again. This time, there was no precedent, only an idea that perhaps the answer to sound was more sound. The Admiralty formed a new unit almost overnight, the Underwater Countermeasure Group, hidden in the damp basements of an evacuated college in Cambridge. Its members were physicists, electricians, and one cellist from the Royal Academy who claimed to understand vibration better than anyone. They worked in secrecy, listening to the sea through miles of cable wound on dusty reels. Hydrophones hissed and crackled. The Atlantic sounded alive, heartbeats of ships, whispers of current, clicks of crustaceans. But beneath it all lay a deeper, artificial pulse, steady and menacing. The mines were out there, listening in return. In early January 1941, the group tested its first idea on the River Ouse. A pair of trawlers carried crude sound bombs, steel barrels packed with generators that mimicked propeller noise. The theory: if they could sing louder than the ships themselves, the mines would detonate harmlessly, fooled by ghosts. The experiment nearly killed them. When the current hit, the barrels roared like beasts. The water trembled, the hulls rattled, and before anyone could cut the switch, a geyser of white water erupted 30 yards off the bow. For a moment, there was silence. Then rain made of salt and shrapnel. The men were soaked but alive. A diver later confirmed what they already knew. The explosion had been a mine. It had heard the false ship and lunged for it. "Gentlemen," said the unit's commander, a man who hadn't slept in 3 days, "we've taught the ocean to jump at shadows." That success gave birth to Britain's first acoustic sweep, a crude but revolutionary system of underwater speakers that played mechanical heartbeats into the deep. The sea responded with fire. Mines exploded prematurely, tearing each other apart, until the channel floor was carpeted with twisted shells. Still, the victories were fragile. The mines adapted. Some now required both magnetic and acoustic triggers. Others ignored continuous tones and waited for patterns of acceleration, as if they could think. The battle shifted to the laboratories. Engineers spent nights hunched over oscillographs, mapping frequencies, trying to predict what a mine wanted to hear. Every adjustment cost lives. Every silence between detonations was filled with dread. At Scapa Flow, an officer watching a test murmured, "It's like the sea is arguing with us." He wasn't wrong. The war had become a conversation. One side spoke in equations, the other in explosions. By February, the countermeasure group had relocated to a coastal bunker near Liverpool, closer to the convoys it was trying to save. There, under the constant drone of planes and the stink of diesel, they refined the device that could project an entire ship's signature into the ocean. The sailors who first saw it didn't believe. A wooden box, a motor, a coil, a handful of wires. Hardly the armor they needed against invisible death. But when the next convoy passed through a mined stretch of water without a single loss, even the most cynical captain logged it plainly. Mines heard what wasn't there and died for it. For the first time, Britain was ahead again. Reports from U-boat captains spoke of premature explosions, of mines failing to discriminate. One German engineer wrote bitterly, "Our devices seem to obey phantom ships." The British scientists smiled at that phrase. Phantom ships, that was exactly what they had created. The sea, once an enemy's ally, now lied for them. And in a basement thick with tobacco smoke, a young technician turned off his machine and whispered to no one in particular, "We've made the ocean dishonest." No one disagreed, because that was the truth of the new war, not bombs, not shells, but deception. The sea itself had become the battlefield, and it was learning to lie beautifully. They called it Fox. Not a weapon, not exactly a machine, just a trick. Something small enough to tow, loud enough to live. By 1941, the engineers in Cambridge had turned their crude sound barrels into something elegant. 2 spinning propeller cages, each laced with steel rods and powered by the ship's own engines. When dropped into the sea and pulled behind a destroyer, they screamed. A high, chaotic metallic shriek that imitated the heartbeat of a full-sized convoy. The sound filled the ocean for miles. The idea was absurdly simple. The Germans had built mines that hunted by hearing. The British would give them something louder to hear. Sailors didn't trust it. The first time a destroyer captain saw the blueprint, he laughed. "You want me to drag a noisemaker through a minefield?" But orders were orders, and desperation was a better motivator than faith. They tested the prototype near Liverpool in spring 1941. 2 trawlers sailed parallel courses, each towing the spinning contraptions. The noise was unbearable, an endless metallic howl that rolled through the hull and set men's teeth on edge. One stoker stuffed cotton into his ears and shouted, "If the mines don't kill us, this bloody racket will." But the mines did detonate, 30 of them, far astern. The trawlers came home untouched. The device was refined, weaponized, and given a name that fit its character. Foxer. Officially, it was a noisemaker decoy. Unofficially, it was the first time humanity had taught the ocean to lie. By 1943, every convoy crossing the Atlantic carried at least one Foxer. The Germans had improved their acoustic torpedoes. Zonkenig, they called them, the wren, a hunter that listened for propellers and chased them relentlessly. But the British had found their countersong. The Foxer's howl masked the true ship's sounds and drew the torpedoes away, luring them into empty water. A captain's report from convoy on 207 reads simply, 2 torpedoes struck the noise astern. The crew heard them scream and die. God bless the noise. The U-boat commanders, watching through periscopes, couldn't understand it. Their precious Zonkenigs exploded prematurely, chasing ghosts. "Our torpedoes betray us," one officer wrote in his log. They listened to someone else. For the British, it was a grim satisfaction. The sound that once killed them now worked in their favor. The convoys no longer moved silently. They roared across the Atlantic, a moving storm of steel and deceit. The Foxer's cry could be heard underwater for miles, a constant metallic shriek echoing through the darkness. And yet, that noise had a cost. Crews hated it. The endless clatter of spinning blades made it impossible to sleep, to think, even to pray. Submarine hunters complained that they could no longer hear approaching U-boats on sonar. The decoys drowned out everything. One sailor said, "The Foxer keeps us alive, but it also drives us mad." In one report, a destroyer's engineer wrote, "We've made the sea a liar, and it lies to us too. We can't tell what's real anymore." Still, the results were undeniable. After the widespread deployment of Foxer and its cousin, the CAT, counter-acoustic torpedo, losses from acoustic mines and torpedoes dropped sharply. Convoys that once feared every mile now steamed through the night in a cacophony of safety. The Germans tried to counter it. They built smarter mines, adjusted listening frequencies, tried to filter out the false noise. But the Foxer's signal was too irregular, too alive. Its roar mimicked not one ship, but dozens, an entire fleet of ghosts singing through the deep. In Berlin, an engineer reportedly slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "We've made weapons that can think, but the British have taught them to dream." By late 1943, the Atlantic had changed character. The quiet stalkers' war of the early U-boats had become a theater of sound. The ocean itself was never silent. The pulse of convoys, the hum of sonar, the Foxer's metallic laughter. The surface looked peaceful, but beneath it raged an orchestra of deception. When the first captured U-boat was examined, the crew's logbook carried an entry scrawled in frustration. "Our minds behave like frightened animals. They detonate at whispers, at shadows, at nothing. The sea no longer obeys us." In a small lab in Portsmouth, a British engineer read that line aloud and smiled faintly. "Then it's working," he said. What had begun as a desperate defense had become an art of illusion. Britain didn't just survive the mine war, it redefined it. A young scientist, leaning over a chart, whispered late one night, "We've made the ocean a storyteller. Every explosion, it tells the same lie, that it found a ship. But the ship was never there." By the end of the war, the Germans still had no explanation. Their reports to Admiral Donitz contained the same maddening phrase, "Mines detonated spontaneously. Cause unknown." The truth stayed locked in the Admiralty vaults for decades. The sea had been taught to deceive, and it never forgot how. In the spring of 1945, the sea was quiet again. No magnetic hum, no echo of explosions, just the slow breathing of tides along the English coast. A Royal Navy officer stood on the shore near Portsmouth, watching the gray water roll in. He had spent 6 years fighting a war he could never see. Now, as he listened to the surf, he said quietly, "We weren't fighting for the ocean. We were fighting for the line between fear and understanding." He wasn't wrong. For most of the men who had lived through it, the mine war had no clear front and no victory parade. Ships had disappeared without warning. Entire fields of mines had exploded for no reason, and both sides had blamed ghosts, weather, fate. The truth remained buried under layers of secrecy and salt water. In Germany, Admiral Donitz's final reports were full of unanswered questions. "British defenses," he wrote, "appear to affect magnetic and acoustic properties beyond prediction, possibly linked to Earth's field." It was the only explanation they could imagine, that the enemy had somehow learned to control the planet's invisible forces. In a sense, they had. In London, inside the same Cambridge basement where the first magnetic coils had been wound in 1939, a few surviving engineers gathered for a final debrief. The war was ending. Their instruments, still humming faintly, were being boxed up and marked classified, "Do not open." Someone wrote on a chalkboard, "Victory through uncertainty," then wiped it clean. None of them had medals. Their war was measured not in battles won, but in detonations prevented, in tonnage that didn't sink. They had fought with waveforms, with decibels and Gauss meters, with the patience to listen to a world most people never heard. A report from 1946 summed it up. "We did not destroy the enemy's weapons. We destroyed his confidence." Across the North Sea, German scientists in Kiel opened their own archives and found only failure. Schematics for smart mines, blueprints for acoustic triggers, notes scribbled in despair, British countermeasures incomprehensible. Hypothesis: atmospheric influence or divine intervention. The irony was simple. The British had never built a single perfect weapon, only imperfect noise. But that noise had been enough. When the files were finally declassified decades later, historians were stunned by the scale. Over 200,000 magnetic and acoustic mines had been neutralized, either detonated or rendered useless. The Royal Navy's countermeasure network, miles of cable, thousands of ships, hundreds of Foxers screaming through the deep, had turned the ocean itself into a machine of deception. Yet those who made it happen rarely spoke of it. They had seen too much strangeness. Instruments that behaved like living things, waves that echoed back answers when no signal had been sent. More than one technician swore he'd heard something beneath the static, patterns, rhythms, even a kind of breathing. "It's the sea," an old operator once said. "It remembers the sounds we taught it." When the war ended, the machines were shut down. The cables rusted, the decoys sank. But the knowledge remained. Every modern navy in the world still uses what began there: degaussing, acoustic masking, magnetic sweeps. The vocabulary of invisible war. Standing on that same shore years later, the officer from Portsmouth was asked what he thought they had really achieved. He paused, watching the gray horizon, and said, "We learned how fragile power is. All our ships, our guns, our fleets, they mean nothing if the sea itself decides to turn against us." He walked away without another word. Because the truth was simple, and it was heavy. The war beneath the waves had never truly ended. It had only gone quiet. The technology that saved convoys in 1943 would evolve into the sonar nets of the Cold War, the undersea sensors that now listen for submarines no one admits exist. In the end, the real victory wasn't in the explosions, it was in silence. The silence that followed every detonation, every trick, every lie told to the sea. It was the silence of a new kind of warfare, one fought not for territory or pride, but for control of what could not be seen or heard. A memo discovered in the Admiralty archives decades later carried a single line in pencil. "The sea is honest no more." No signature, no date, just the echo of an idea that had changed the course of history. Because in that unseen war, they proved something extraordinary. You don't always need to overpower the enemy. Sometimes, all you need is to make his own weapons fear the dark. And the ocean, quiet, endless, patient, has never forgotten how to listen.